Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Next section, Brother Tarek, is about the prophethood in the early human history. How does Islam explain the selection of Adam, peace be upon him, as the first prophet?
So in this particular section, if you would not mind, I will expand a little bit because there's something here I would like to bring to the concept in front. And it is very beautiful. And I really, when I read the Quran and I study through this, I feel that Allah is really pointing things out to us in a very beautiful way. Before we talk about the Prophet Adam as a selection as the first prophet, I want you to look how the Quran tells us about creation. And we'll step back in creation a little bit second here to help me bring this forward. When the Quran tells us about creation, Allah says in the Quran that He created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. And then in another area, it says that He put the provisions of the earth in 4 days. In 4 days. What those days are, length of those days is not the issue. It's just a length of time, some time, whatever the length of that time is, we don't know. But the most important thing here for me when I hear this, especially today, when we see that when we have the ability to see out in the universe very, very far away, why would Allah single out the earth when He's talking about the creation of the heavens as a whole? When you understand that, when you think about this is something, a special creation. In other words, when you talk about a person, you don't talk about a person and his nose. The nose is automatically part of the person, right? You may talk about the person and his intellect, or the person and his actions. You specifically look at the piece of him that is really, really important. So when Allah tells us He creates the heavens and the earth, in another verse He says that the creation of the heavens is much bigger than your creation, if you would only know. So the creation of the heavens is something grand, but Allah also tells us to focus on the earth. And when He talks about the earth, in the creation of the heavens in 6 days, the earth has from those 6 days has pieces of 4 days to put all the provisions in the earth. And then we look at what He's created for us in the earth. He's given us, and if you study this a little bit, and I'm sorry, my mind is a bit scientific, so I look at these things a little bit. But if you study some of these things, Allah says, for instance, in Surah Al-Hadid, that He has the iron that's in the earth has come down from the heavens. It has not been always part of the earth. And it's the iron in the earth, in the core of the earth, that gives us the magnetic field that protects us from the cosmic rays from the sun. At the same time, it provides us direction. That's how the birds fly. That's how we understand direction through the compasses and so on. So that's one thing. And then the water, I'm just giving a couple more examples, and that's it. Look at the water, for instance. Allah gives us the water. And the water is one of the few compounds that freezes, that becomes lighter as a solid compared to all other compounds. Other compounds, when they become solid, they sink in the liquid of that compound. They become really heavy and they sink. Whereas whereas ice floats on top of water. In the creation of the earth, that provides us, it ensures that the water on the earth does not freeze all the way down from the bottom up and becomes unavailable to us. In that process, the water forms the cloud, the sun forms the cloud with the water, the evaporation, and the clouds come across the earth and they rain and they cause the earth to be full of water. And then as it becomes full of water, the crops start coming out and the food start coming out. So even in the creation of the earth, Allah made it something very special. And that is one thing. When you understand that tells you that this is a special place that Allah created for human beings and made it really comfortable and beautiful and habitable in a way that makes us able to live on there. And then after that's created, Allah tells the angels and announces to the angels that He's creating Adam. Just that announcement by itself is a special privilege that Allah takes the time to announce to some of His other creatures, which are the angels and the jinn, to announce to them that He's going to create a human being. In that announcement, that is a very high level of honor. that Allah shows us in this, that not everybody, not all the other creatures were announced. Not other creatures after that were announced that way, right? And that elevates the level of humanity very much. So when Allah has done that with Adam, and He's also given Adam something, as the father of humanity, He's given him something very special, which is the ability to understand things, have knowledge and understand things that even the angels did not understand. And what we see in this selection of the human being, especially with Adam and then all his progeny and us as a default, is that the human being has the ability to see and imagine things based on the knowledge he has or she has, and to actually enable himself to put them together and put them forward. And if you look at the creation of what human beings have done, it's different than all the other creatures that have done. And I'm going to stop here with this, but this is really when we look at it, Adam is being announced as the first human being. He's also been given the knowledge because of him being in a paradise or a Jannah or a Garden of Eden before he comes to the earth. He is given a knowledge and a view of humanity, and a view of humanity that no other human being has. And he's given the first message that he's supposed to tell his children and all the progeny that comes later after that. And of course, these early generations lived 1,000 years. So Prophet Adam, so many of his children, great-great-grandchildren, and so on, and as he gave the message and pushed the message forward with them.
So moving forward from Adam time to the his successors of prophets, what are the lessons from the early prophets, such as Noah, Hud, that we can learn from?
So the interesting thing with the lessons of the prophets, what you see, the Quran talks about the prophets in many different surahs. Sometimes the story is abbreviated, sometimes the story is expanded very much. But many times he talks about the prophets in succession, and prophets remind their people of prophets before them and what happened to them. So the main lesson that we see in early prophets has been Sayyidina Nuh. He kept giving the message for 950 years. 950 years. These early people lived very long, and they lived 1,000 years generally, and he gave the message for 950 years. And 950 years, in that time, the humanity that believed with him was a very small amount, and small enough to be carried on that ark with him. Just imagine giving the message for 950 years, and all you get from everybody is just a handful of people that can fit on a boat. For those early prophets, what happened is they would give the message, and nobody would listen. And they would keep telling him, for instance, those people that are with you, that believe with you, these are the poor people. We don't need to be with them. We're different. We have class. We have this. We have money, whatever. And they kept pushing this thing away. And these early prophets, they would give the message and the people would not listen. And how Allah treated them was complete annihilation. That nation does not exist at all. Only the few believers came with the prophet, and the rest of that nation was completely gone. Not only was it gone, it was left as a mark in history that people knew about. It wasn't just, it was gone. So at the time of Sayyidina Nuh, people, as I said, lived 1,000 years. But the time of the other prophets, their lives were not as long. They were more akin to roughly the 120 years of human life that is available in many cases. And in those early prophets also, with Hud, with Saleh, and with many others, right? These prophets also did the same thing. They would tell their people, and they would give them signs from Allah about the truth of their message, and their signs were generally localized to them, right? But they give the signs from Allah that they've given them the message to, and each of these people had a different characteristic of behavior. One of them would steal money from people. The others would be building, and they had armies, and they were very strong, and everyone was different. And in those prophets, what happened was, again, the people did not behave. They did not follow through correctly. And what happens is Allah would, again, take the believers with the prophet, the few believers with the prophet, they leave the town, and Allah would destroy the rest of the town. and everybody in there gets destroyed. And again, their remnants come signs for us. We see that, for instance, in northern Arabia right now is the area called Mada and Salih, the area where the Salih people lived, the tribes of Salih lived, and you see what these look like. You see these tall mesas, right, with carved buildings, carved things inside there, and they were really high up, and they showed their capability. They were very strong and very good with things like this. You see that, you can actually see that, and of course today we know about the Dead Sea where Lot was when Allah when He left. The whole town collapsed on top of the people, and this is where the Dead Sea is. The Dead Sea is today. For Muslims in general, these are places generally not to visit, not to be around, because these are places where Allah has put His wrath or His anger on in that area. But from an archaeological perspective, they're very interesting to see places such as that. So these are many of the older prophets. A lot of things, a lot of this. This is what we see in there with the people around them. That the message was not obeyed, and the message was verbal and shown and talked to very much, and basically they make fun of the prophets and everything just disappears.
Excellent. So the next topic is about the polytheism and idolatry. How did the earliest prophet address the challenge of polytheism and idolatry?
In the earlier prophets, this was the key issue. Because the key issue with them was the issue that they would worship idols. And these idols would be in the form of anything they could carve out of stone or carve out of wood, and they would put them up. And they were generally along the argument that we are worshiping them to get us closer to Allah. And they would say, well, we are not very good. Sometimes we're not so good, so we cannot talk to Allah. We cannot talk directly to Allah or something of that nature. And then, so we have to do it through these idols because these idols talk to Allah directly or something, some issues like that. And in those elements, the prophets would always tell them that you have to worship Allah directly. You cannot worship Allah through idols. These idols don't benefit you in any way. And they can see that they don't benefit when they break or they push down or destroyed. It doesn't help. They don't help you in it. They cannot help you in any way. And they kept telling them over and over this idea that you cannot be worshiping the idols. And in some cases, of course, they worshipped many, many different idols, depending on the time or the season, or whether they weren't going to war, or whatever it is, they would invent these different idols that they would put up, and the prophets would constantly tell them that this is not what Allah wants you to do. Allah wants you to worship Him only. So many of these people would say, well, if you're telling us that Allah will destroy us if we do this, bring this destruction on. Instead of saying guide us, they would say bring this destruction on. And of course, in many cases, Allah brought the destruction on. But they kept addressing this by telling them over and over and over again, come back to Allah. Don't worship the idols. The idols don't benefit you in any way. They don't really show you anything. They don't give you anything. You're the ones who are making them. How could they help you? And this issue continued like this. To be honest, some of this idol worship still exists till today. But these prophets were very, very adamant in terms of telling them, this does not help you in any way. It does not show you anything. It does not help you anything. You are making them. They're not doing anything for you. But of course, today, we also have different forms of idols, right? It's not just physical statues that are being built, but there's other ways that we idolize stars or people or many different things like that.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that, Brother Tarek? What is the new idols?
Form of idols? Yeah, so some of the biggest idols of today's society are, of course, wealth, right? The accumulation of wealth and wanting wealth and competing on who has the largest amount of wealth. And this is not what Allah wants from us. It's not who has the most money that wins at the end. It means nothing. The more money you have to give to help others, not accumulate it and put bigger numbers on your account to say I'm richer than anybody else. And we see this today very clearly. That's one of the biggest forms of wealth, the forms of idol worship. Another form of idol worship is personalities, worshiping personalities. In other words, people are doing everything for that wealth or for that personality. They basically give up everything in their lives with money, for instance. They're looking to make money in any way possible, shape, or form. And it doesn't make a difference if this hurts their family, if it hurts other people around them, if it's obtained in a haram way. It's the idea of I want to be wealthier than anybody else. I want to climb up the ladder of wealth. And that's really a form of idol worship. Another thing, as I said, is worshiping particular individuals because they look in through the media, they look like they're really grand forms of individuals, really impressive and so on, and following them on all sorts of social media just because they're the best people you can think of, and or their beauty or any of that. Beauty is another thing, of course. Today's focus on beauty and focus on youth and how do I constantly change my face and my body to look younger and younger. That's another form of, if you're excessively focused on that, and that's the only thing you do everything for, that's what you spend your money on, then it becomes a form of idol worship in a way. Of course, it's different levels here. It's not the same as worshiping a stone statue in front of you, but still, it's taking your heart away from worshiping Allah the right way. Others could be worshiping their family lineage, if that becomes an big issue, that my family is better than your family, and I have a lineage to the Prophet, so therefore I'm a better person than you. And the Prophet and the Quran tells us very clearly that being related to the Prophet doesn't save you in any way. It only what saves you is your actions and your deeds. And so that's what this is really more about. Is what do we fill our day with instead of worshiping Allah? Does making money take me away from prayers? Does making money take me away from reading the Quran? Does making money taking me away from paying my zakah, and so on, or going to Hajj, right, or something like that?
Jazakallah khairan. The next question is the concept of prophethood in itself. It may be different from other religions. So the question as follows: how do the narratives of prophets in Islam differ from those in other religious traditions?
So it's in other religious traditions, that's a good question, actually. Other religious traditions, in many cases, when the prophet passes, they tend to become more of a reference point, and in a way, it starts becoming idols. In many cases, they start becoming idols. What we see, for instance, is in Islam, the idea of a prophet is a prophet as a human being. And that human being is trying to help us come closer to Allah, not the worship of that human being. Recall that the Quran mentions 25 different prophets by name in the Quran. Other religious traditions, especially from the Abrahamic faith, they may have a couple or more other prophets by name there. But the Prophet Muhammad said there's 120, I think 126,000 roughly, prophets walked on the earth. It would not be surprising for us to think and see that prominent individuals in history, such as Buddha, such as Krishna, such as other names like this that we hear across the globe, that they may have been prophets. But what happened with them is they became idolized. They were changed from being prophets and following what their guidance was into being idolized and looked at in terms of a statue or something like that, and changed. So their narrative changed. When the Prophet was there, the Prophet talked to people about guidance to Allah, but after they died, they made different things about the Prophet and started worshiping that Prophet. We tend to see that also slightly in certain Christian traditions. The cross becomes the biggest symbol of that prophet, of the Prophet Isa, in the church, that it distracts from the actual relationship to Allah. And we see that in even some of how Jesus has become deified in some of the Christian traditions, and people start worshiping Jesus instead of worshiping Allah directly. So the narratives change, and in Islam, Allah made it very clear for us that the Prophet Muhammad is a prophet, and he made sure that we understand that even through the shahada that we say, I bear witness that there's no God except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his prophet. So it becomes clear that we don't mix things up together. And in other cases, I said that a mix has happened, and the worship has moved from worshiping Allah into worshiping the Prophet after that. And of course, in one other thing I want to catch up on that, the prophets, we have to understand also the prophets in general are not falling into major sins because they are the ones who are guiding people. So they cannot be falling into major sins. And in some of the religious traditions that have been before Islam that have changed the narrative of what the Prophet did, they put the Prophet in major sins, which is something we cannot accept and we cannot see. They are the ones who are guiding humanity. They cannot fall in the sin that they're trying to tell people not to fall into.
Excellent. The last question in this section is, what role did divine miracles play in the mission of the early prophets? How did the miracles that Allah granted to the prophets play a significant role in their life at their time?
The miracles that Allah gave to the prophets at their hand, at their command, was to help their people believe and help their people move forward. He would give them, for instance, the splitting of the sea with Moses, or the stick that converts to a snake, right? That whole, I want you just to think yourself. If you would come to a sea and all of a sudden it would split up into two walls that you could walk through, what kind of a miracle that would be? Those miracles were made and given to these prophets so that they become a way for them to convince their people about the truth of their word. And they were so grand in many cases that they made people stop and see and listen and watch. But in many cases, what we see that, first of all, these miracles were only for the people of the time. They were not miracles that lasted. We read about them in the Quran, but the miracle itself was witnessed only by the people of the time. And what we see with these miracles is that the people, very interestingly, once they see those miracles, for some reason, they like the miracle because it explains something. And then after that, they convert that miracle into more demands from the prophet to see more things like this. In other words, it doesn't help them. It does help them. It does help the believers in them to stay on path. But for many people, it made them more demanding of other supernatural things like this. But the miracles were intended to bring people back to the path and keep them on the path and help them understand that their prophet is speaking the truth and the prophet is trying to guide them to Allah and show them the right way.
Excellent. That sounds really great. So we covered 2 sections so far, and we have 3 more to come, but we only have 10 minutes left. So I would rather not to start a new section, Brother Tarek, but I would rather have you give us any additional insights in the next 5 minutes or so that I did not ask you questions to cover. And then we'll open the floor to the audience to ask a question. And the remaining 3 sections will be handled, inshallah, in subsequent lesson. Most likely it will be on April 27th, if your schedule allows for that, inshallah. So give us more thoughts that I did not ask you about. Anything that you really want to add and you see it more interesting and more exciting to the audience to know. Let's talk about that for 5 minutes, and then we'll open the floor, inshallah, for the last 5 or 7 minutes.
Right. Okay. I think one of the most important things for us to do in Muslims is to the stories of the prophets and get to know them very well. Each prophet has his own characteristic and his own way of doing things and his own that he worked with. And it's a good idea to actually review these prophets and get to understand these prophets and use them as examples for us. Because, of course, from the Islamic perspective, we believe in all of these prophets. We believe in all of them. They're divinely guided human beings. They are ones who all came to ask us to worship only Allah, and they all came to be our guidance in many ways. So we should always look to these prophets, learn their stories, understand who they are, understand what they went through, and learn the stories from the Quran, and then learn the stories from the hadith and go through the books of the hadith about wherever the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ talks about some of these prophets. And there's many books that we have, scholars that put books together of these stories from the Quran. They put all the stories sequentially so you can read it and get the whole story complete in your mind. But we should get to know them all because each one of them comes with a unique perspective and a unique way of saying things. And if we look in the Quran, each prophet was tested differently, and each prophet has a different dua in their tests. And all of their ad'iyah, all of their du'as apply to all of us today. Right. And so if you're needing a child, the dua of Zakaria is very interesting. If you're needing guidance or something, the dua of Sayyidina Musa is very interesting. If you're needing, all of them have different du'as that we could use, and they teach us how to converse with Allah when we ask and need something. So I think it's very important to study the prophets and to get to know them as best as possible and use them as inspiration in terms of how we act.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. And